And he was explaining that she was injured. When in fact the private secretary, Michael, was telling the six of us in the office that sadly she'd died.
There are moments in history that split time into two distinct halves, the world before and the world after. The death of Princess Diana on August 31st, 1997, was one of those moments. It shook governments, silenced cities, and brought hundreds of millions of people to their knees in grief. Flowers piled 6 feet deep outside Kensington Palace. Strangers wept openly on the streets of London, Paris, New York, and Tokyo. An entire planet mourned a woman who had somehow made each of them feel personally known, personally loved. But while the world processed its grief through candlelight vigils and tearful news broadcasts, there were people working quietly in the shadows. People who had known Diana not as an icon, but as a human being. People who had driven her through London streets, opened car doors for her, exchanged small jokes with her on long journeys. People who carried not just the weight of national mourning, but the particular, devastating grief of having lost someone they personally cared for. And for nearly 3 decades, those people have largely stayed silent. Until now. Colin Tebbit served as one of Princess Diana's most trusted and loyal drivers during some of the most turbulent years of her life. He was not a peripheral figure. He was a constant, quiet presence in her daily world. He knew her routines, her moods, her humor, and her warmth in ways that very few people ever did. And on the night of August 31st, 1997, his world, like the rest of ours, was shattered beyond recognition. But unlike the rest of us, he then had to get up, travel to Paris, and perform duties so emotionally overwhelming that most people cannot even begin to imagine them. For years, Colin Tebbit said nothing publicly. He carried his grief privately, professionally, and with the quiet dignity that had defined his entire service to the Princess of Wales. But now, in a remarkable and long-awaited decision, he has chosen to speak. And what he has to say does not simply fill in the gaps of a story we thought we already knew. It fundamentally reshapes our understanding of what happened during those harrowing hours, and what it truly cost the people who were there. This is Colin Tebbit's story, and the world was not prepared for it. To understand why Colin Tebbit's words carry such extraordinary weight, you first have to understand who he was in Diana's life. He was not a stranger assigned to escort a celebrity from one appointment to another. He was a figure of trust, consistency, and discretion in a world that often offered Diana very little of any of those things. Princess Diana lived under a microscope from the moment she married Prince Charles in 1981. Every outing, every expression, every stumble and triumph was documented, analyzed, and broadcast to a ravenous global audience. In that environment, the people she could genuinely trust were few and precious. Her drivers represented something rare, a protected space. Inside a car, moving through the city, Diana could breathe. She could laugh without being photographed doing it. She could speak without being quoted. She could simply exist as a person rather than a performance. Colin understood this instinctively, and he honored it completely. Over the years of his service, a bond developed between them. Not a friendship in the conventional sense, because the professional lines were always respected, but something real and meaningful nonetheless. She trusted him, and he, in turn, developed a deep admiration and affection for the woman he saved. He remembers her laughter. He remembers the way she could fill a car with warmth on even the most difficult days. He remembers her asking about his life, his family, treating him not as furniture, not as a function, but as a human being worthy of genuine interest and conversation. In an era when Diana was publicly celebrated for her empathy toward hospital patients and landmine survivors and AIDS sufferers, Colin witnessed that same empathy in its most everyday, unperformed form. She was, he says, exactly who she appeared to be. And that, perhaps more than anything, is what made losing her so devastating. When Colin finally sat down to speak about that night, it was not with the eagerness of someone seeking attention. It was with the careful, measured tone of a man who has spent decades deciding whether the world deserves to hear what he has to say, and finally concluded that it does. The evening of August 30th, 1997 had been an ordinary one for Colin Tebbit. He was at home, settled into the quiet rhythms of private life that formed the counterbalance to his professional duties. There was nothing in the air that evening to suggest anything unusual was coming. No premonition, no unease, just a simple, unremarkable piece of an ordinary Saturday night in late summer. Then the phone rang. His wife answered first. The caller was a colleague, someone familiar, and the early moments of the conversation were light, casual exchanges, the kind of small talk that happens between people who know each other well. But something shifted. A tone changed, and his wife, recognizing in an instant that something was deeply wrong, held out the phone and told Colin that he needed to sit down before he took this call. Those words, "sit down before you take this call," represent one of those small, terrible moments that survivors of tragedy remember with crystalline precision long after larger events have blurred. Colin sat on the edge of the bed. He took the phone, and in the seconds that followed, the world he had known came apart. Princess Diana had been involved in a serious car accident in Paris. The details were still coming in. The situation was grave. Colin's first instinct was disbelief, the kind of instinct that kicks in as a kind of psychological mercy when reality is simply too large to absorb all at once. He turned on the television, and there it was. Breaking news banners, shaky footage, reporters speaking in urgent, hushed tones outside the Petit-Salpêtrière hospital. The world was already learning what he had just been told, but seeing it on screen made it simultaneously more and less real. More because the evidence was undeniable, less because it felt like something happening in a film rather than in his actual life. He has described those minutes as a kind of suspended state, where time seemed to both stop and accelerate simultaneously. Part of his mind was processing information. Another part refused to process anything at all. And beneath it all, a professional instinct was already beginning to stir. The deeply ingrained awareness that if something had happened to Princess Diana, then there were duties to be performed, responsibilities to be honored, and he would almost certainly be called upon to perform them. That call came quickly. Colin Tebbit was needed. He would be traveling to Paris. He began to prepare, moving through the necessary motions with a disciplined focus that he credits entirely to his training and his professional pride. But those who have experienced acute grief will recognize the particular quality of movement he describes, the strange clarity that comes when you simply cannot afford to fall apart, because there are things that need to be done. He was not numb. He was not calm. He was functioning in spite of himself, driven forward by duty when everything else inside him wanted to stop. The journey to Kensington Palace, his first destination before the flight to Paris, passed in a fog of fragmented thoughts and barely contained emotion. London itself seemed different that night, or perhaps he was simply different, and the city around him had not yet caught up to what he already knew. Kensington Palace in the hours following the crash was a place transformed. Colin Tebbit arrived to find an atmosphere unlike anything he had previously experienced, a compound that normally operated with the measured, purposeful efficiency of a royal household now vibrating with barely suppressed panic and grief. The people who worked within those walls were professionals, trained, experienced, accustomed to managing the complex logistics of royal life. But no training prepares you for this. No protocol exists for the moment when the person at the center of your professional world is gone. The competence was still there. The focus was still functioning. But beneath it ran a current of raw, unprocessed horror that no amount of discipline could fully contain. For Colin, arriving at Kensington that night meant confronting, for the first time, the collective reality of what had happened. On the phone and in front of his television, he had been absorbing the information alone. He was surrounded by others who shared it, who wore the same stunned expression, who moved with the same careful, slightly mechanical precision of people keeping themselves together through sheer force of will. He has spoken about the particular quality of grief that fills a space when a community has lost its center. It is different from individual mourning. It carries a disorienting quality, the sense that not just a person but an organizing principle has been removed, and that everything which structured daily life has become suddenly, terrifyingly uncertain. His mission was clarified at Kensington. He would travel to Paris as part of the official party responsible for accompanying Princess Diana's body back to Britain. The gravity of this task, the weight of what it meant and what it would require, settled over him with a finality that he describes as almost physical. He was going to Paris not to help, not to support recovery efforts, but to bring her home. And that distinction, between the hope of helping and the certainty of loss, changed everything. The flight to Paris was quiet in the way that flights sometimes are when everyone on board is carrying something too heavy to put into words. Colin sat with his thoughts, with his preparations, with the particular internal composure that duty demands even when the heart is in open revolt. Landing in Paris brought an immediate collision with the scale of global attention that Diana's death had generated. The city was overwhelmed. International media had descended in numbers that transformed normally navigable streets into gauntlets of cameras, reporters, satellite equipment, and the barely managed chaos of a story that had captured the entire planet's attention simultaneously. There was a surreal quality to it. The world's grief made suddenly, overwhelmingly visible in the form of lenses and lights and urgent voices in a dozen different languages. Colin has spoken candidly about the practical difficulties he faced upon arriving in Paris. He did not speak French, and in a situation where every conversation potentially mattered enormously, this created genuine anxiety. He was fortunate to have support. His wife's command of the French language proved invaluable during these initial hours, helping him navigate communications that would otherwise have been impenetrable. This practical detail, small and human amid the immensity of tragedy, reveals the reality of what these situations actually require. Not just emotional strength, not just professional competence, but the mundane problem-solving of language barriers and unfamiliar systems. He also found unexpected comfort in the presence of familiar faces. Brigadier Ritchie, serving as a military attaché who had connections to the royal household through his work with Princess Anne, was among those present and offered Colin both practical assistance and the stabilizing comfort of a known presence in an overwhelming environment. In moments of crisis, Colin has observed, these small human connections, a familiar voice, a recognized face, become anchors of extraordinary importance. The journey to the hospital where Diana had been treated was its own kind of preparation, a liminal space between knowing what had happened and confronting it directly. Colin was aware of what awaited him. He understood intellectually what his duties would require. But the distance between intellectual understanding and lived experience, as he would discover, is vast and unbridgeable. The Petit-Salpêtrière hospital had become, in the hours since the crash, something beyond a medical facility. It was a site of convergence, for grieving staff who had fought and failed to save a patient against impossible odds, for officials managing the formal requirements of an international tragedy, for media and mourners pressing against its perimeter, and for the handful of people like Colin who carried specific, solemn responsibilities inside its walls. Colin has described his arrival at the hospital as the moment when everything he had been holding together through discipline and duty began to press hardest against his capacity to contain it. The clinical environment, its particular combination of sterile efficiency and profound human suffering, created a dissonance that he found difficult to navigate. Medical institutions are designed around the business of saving lives. But the work was done. The battle was over. What remained was something that medicine cannot address and protocol cannot fully honor. He was brought to the room where Princess Diana lay. And it is here that Colin's account becomes most difficult to describe, because he is speaking about something that exists at the very limit of what language can carry. He had known her. He had served her. He had shared the everyday intimacies of driving someone through the rhythms of their life. The early mornings, the long evenings, the journeys between private and public worlds. And now he was standing in a room in Paris, looking at the end of all of that. The physical conditions of the room affected him deeply and immediately. It was uncomfortably warm, inadequately equipped for the solemnity of what it now housed, exposed in ways that struck Colin as a violation of the dignity she deserved. The windows lacked curtains. The space felt too open, too visible, too far from the privacy that Diana had so rarely been granted in life and deserved absolutely in death. His response was immediate and instinctive. He improvised, using available blankets to cover windows, arranging whatever practical measures were possible to create a barrier between Diana and the outside world. These were not grand gestures. They were small, practical acts of protection. But in performing them, Colin was doing what he had always done, creating a space of safety and dignity for a woman who had trusted him to do exactly that. And then something happened that he has found almost impossible to speak about without it affecting him visibly, even now, decades later. A fan that had been brought into the room to address the heat created a slight movement of air, and in that small breeze, Princess Diana's eyelashes moved. It was nothing. It was the physics of air against delicate tissues. It carried no meaning beyond the accidental cruelty of resemblance. The way a trick of light or movement can briefly, terribly suggest the presence of something that is no longer there. Colin knew this. He understood exactly what he was seeing and exactly what it meant. But understanding something intellectually and experiencing it are entirely different things. He had to stop. He had to step back. He had to give himself a moment, just a moment, before he could continue. He speaks about this memory with a quiet devastation that no polished words can improve upon. It is the moment in his account where the professional and the personal collapse entirely into one another, where the driver and the grieving human being become indistinguishable. And it is, perhaps, the single detail that most powerfully communicates the human cost of what those closest to Diana were asked to bear. As Colin pieced together the events of that night, through official briefings, subsequent investigations, and the accounts of medical personnel, a clearer picture emerged of the desperate battle that had been waged inside the operating rooms of Pitti Salpêtrière in the hours before his arrival. Princess Diana had been brought to the hospital in critical condition following the crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. The paramedics and emergency responders at the scene had worked urgently to stabilize her before transport, but the severity of her internal injuries was only fully understood upon her arrival at the hospital. The central and most devastating finding was massive internal bleeding, injuries of a kind that presented an almost impossibly narrow window for surgical intervention. The medical team that received her was experienced and dedicated, led by Professor Bruno Rive and with the assistance of Professor Alain Pavey, a respected cardiac surgeon. They undertook emergency procedures with full understanding of the stakes and with every tool at their disposal. A critical tear in the left pulmonary vein, a major blood vessel located close to the heart, had caused catastrophic blood loss that the surgical team fought desperately to address. The pericardium, the protective membrane surrounding the heart, had also been compromised, creating a cascade of complications that each demanded simultaneous attention. For over an hour, the team employed every available measure to restore and maintain cardiac function. Direct cardiac massage was performed. Electrical cardioversion was attempted multiple times in efforts to restore a sustainable heart rhythm. The procedures being undertaken represented the full commitment of a specialized medical team refusing to accept inevitability, fighting, as Colin describes it, with everything they had. But the injuries were insurmountable. At approximately 4 o'clock in the morning of August 31st, 1997, the decision was made to cease resuscitation efforts. Princess Diana was pronounced dead. Colin has reflected at length on the medical team who treated Diana, and his reflections are characterized by deep respect and empathy. These were professionals who had given everything they had to save a life, and who then had to live with the knowledge that they had failed, not through incompetence, not through negligence, but because some injuries simply cannot be survived. The subsequent period, during which conspiracy theories and public suspicion questioned the quality of Diana's care, was deeply painful for Colin to witness. He speaks with obvious relief about Operation Paget, the exhaustive Metropolitan Police investigation launched in the early 2000s under the direction of Lord John Stevens, which examined every aspect of the crash and its aftermath with rigorous, independent scrutiny. The inquiry concluded definitively that the medical care provided to Princess Diana was appropriate, competent, and professional. The team that had fought to save her life was vindicated. And while Colin acknowledges that no official finding can fully quiet a determined conspiracy theorist, he emphasizes how much that vindication mattered, both to the medical personnel who had dedicated themselves to impossible odds, and to those like himself who had been present for the aftermath. Among the most striking aspects of Colin Tebbett's account is his unflinching honesty about the guilt he has carried since that night. It is a guilt that most people, hearing its source, would immediately rush to dismiss as irrational, but Colin knows it is not that simple. He was not driving the car that night. He was not in Paris when the crash occurred. By any reasonable external measure, he bears no responsibility for what happened. And yet, as anyone who has ever experienced survivor's guilt, or the particular grief of someone who feels they should have been present, will understand, the internal experience of responsibility does not confine itself to rational limits. He has asked himself, over and over, through years and decades of quiet reflection, what if it had been him behind the wheel that night? What if his presence in Paris had changed something, anything, about how the evening unfolded? What if the chain of events that led to the Pont de l'Alma had bent differently if one element had been different, and he had been that element? These questions have no answers. They cannot have answers, but they have accompanied him, persistently and painfully, for the better part of 30 years. What makes Colin's handling of this guilt remarkable is that he has not allowed it to become self-indulgent or self-destructive. He has examined it with honesty, acknowledged its presence and its power, and simultaneously maintained the clarity to know that it does not reflect actual culpability. He recognizes that the crash was the product of factors entirely outside his control or influence. He knows that no reasonable person would hold him responsible. But he also knows, and this is the honesty that makes his account so compelling, that grief and reason do not always agree, and that the heart does not always accept the arguments that the mind makes. His commitment to Diana's memory has been, in a sense, his response to that guilt. Not atonement, because there is nothing to atone for, but a form of continued service. The same protection, care, and respect that defined his work during her life has extended, in quieter and more private ways, into the decades following her death. His decision to finally speak publicly is itself an extension of this commitment, a choice to add his authentic, carefully guarded account to the historical record, so that the Diana he knew is not lost entirely beneath the accumulated weight of mythology and speculation. In the months and years following Diana's death, the grief of a watching world curdled, in some quarters, into something darker and more corrosive. Conspiracy theories emerged, multiplied, and spread with a persistence that the most rigorous official investigations were unable to fully extinguish. The most prominent and damaging of these theories, advanced most publicly by Mohammed al-Fayed, the father of Dodi Fayed, who also died in the crash, alleged deliberate foul play, specifically suggesting that Diana and Dodi had been killed to prevent a relationship that various powerful parties wished to terminate. These theories subjected a large number of people, medical professionals, officials, investigators, drivers, and staff, to years of public suspicion and private pain. For Colin Tebbit and others who had been intimately involved in the events of that night and its aftermath, watching the public discourse become dominated by unfounded allegations was a particular kind of torment. It made mourning harder. It made healing harder. And it transformed a tragedy of terrible human proportions into a drama that sometimes seemed more interested in villains than in truth. Colin speaks about this chapter with measured but evident frustration. He does not dismiss the human impulse that drives conspiracy thinking, the need to find meaning and agency in events that are overwhelmingly random and senseless. When something this terrible happens to someone this beloved, the mind resists the possibility that it was simply an accident, that there was no scheme, no target, no sinister design, just speed and darkness and a concrete pillar. The randomness is harder to accept than the conspiracy, because randomness offers no one to hold accountable and no lesson to learn. But understanding the psychology does not make the consequences any easier to bear. Operation Paget, the British police investigation that represented the most thorough and independent examination of the crash and its surrounding circumstances, reached clear and unambiguous conclusions. The evidence supported no conspiracy. The crash was the result of a drunk driver operating a vehicle at excessive speed while being pursued by paparazzi photographers. Diana and Dodi died because of those factors, and those factors alone. For Colin, the publication of the Paget report represented a moment of genuine relief. Not vindication, exactly, because he had never personally been at the center of the most damaging allegations, but a clearing of the air that had been thick with suspicion and fostered for too long. The medical team was cleared. The emergency response was assessed and found to be appropriate. The long shadow that conspiracy theories had cast over the people who had worked desperately to save Diana in the worst moments of their professional lives was, at last, officially lifted. He remains clear-eyed about the fact that official investigations do not silence everyone. Some people, he acknowledges, will continue to believe what they choose to believe regardless of evidence. But for those who were there, who lived through the night, who performed the duties, who carried the grief, the validation of their professionalism and integrity by an independent investigation matters profoundly. It does not heal everything, but it helps. One of the most valuable gifts that Colin Tebbit's account offers is a perspective on Diana that exists entirely outside the machinery of celebrity. He is not describing a princess. He is not describing an icon or a symbol or a cause. He is describing someone he knew, which is an entirely different thing, and far rarer. The Diana that Colin describes is fully human in all the ways that public figures are so rarely permitted to be. She was funny, genuinely, spontaneously funny, with a humor that emerged naturally in private moments and that she seemed to relish all the more for its contrast with the formal seriousness that her public role so often demanded. She was warm in a way that was neither performed nor calculated, the kind of warmth that manifests in small acts of attention, in the genuine interest taken in the life of the person sitting in the driver's seat rather than the person sitting across a formal table. She was curious. She was kind. She was, according to Colin, exactly as advertised. And that consistency between public persona and private person is remarkable in someone so relentlessly scrutinized, someone who had every reason and opportunity to be different in private from what she was required to be in public. He also describes her resilience, the capacity she demonstrated, during some of the most painful years of her life, to carry the weight of a failing marriage, an unsympathetic institution, and the relentless attention of a global media apparatus, and still show up with genuine warmth and presence for the people around her. He witnessed this firsthand, in car journeys that sometimes began in the aftermath of difficult events and still, somehow, contained moments of lightness and connection. This dimension of Diana's character, her essential consistency, her genuine humanity, is perhaps the most important part of Colin's legacy contribution. The risk of iconic figures is that they become abstractions. The specificity of memory, her particular laugh, her specific questions, the precise quality of her attention, is the antidote to abstraction. Colin Tebbit carries that specificity, and his willingness to share it is a gift not just to historical record but to everyone who loved her. The question that inevitably surrounds Colin Tebbit's decision to speak after so many years is the question of why. Why now? Why, after decades of careful silence, has he chosen to add his voice to the record? The answer, when you listen to him speak, is not a single thing. It is a combination of factors that have accumulated over time. The passage of years that creates distance without diminishing truth, the recognition that those who were present are aging and that their accounts deserve to exist in the record before they are lost, and something harder to articulate but unmistakably present in everything he says, a sense of obligation. Not obligation to explain himself, or to defend anyone, or to correct any particular misconception, though his account does all of these things, but obligation to Diana, an obligation that he has always felt and has now chosen to honor publicly rather than privately. The same commitment to her dignity and truth that guided his actions in Paris now guides his words in this account. He wants the world to know who she was, what those hours were like, and what the people who served her actually experienced. He believes she deserves that, and after nearly 30 years of silence, he has decided he agrees with himself enough to say it out loud. Princess Diana died in the early hours of August 31st, 1997. She was 36 years old. The world mourned in a way it had never mourned before and has not mourned since, with an intensity and a universality that still defies easy explanation, even decades later. But behind that world mourning were people who mourned differently, more quietly, more personally, and in many ways more painfully, because they had more to lose. Colin Tebbit was one of those people. He lost, in a single phone call on an ordinary Saturday evening, not just an employer but a presence that had shaped his professional life and touched his human one. He then had to travel to Paris, perform duties of extraordinary emotional weight, and return to a life changed in ways that no one who had not been there could fully understand. His silence over the decades since was not indifference. It was the opposite, a form of protection, of respect, of the same discretion that had defined his service while she was alive. And his decision to finally break that silence is not a betrayal of that discretion. It is its final expression, a carefully considered, deeply intentional act of testimony by a man who believes that the full truth about those hours, told with compassion and honesty, is better for Diana's memory than continued silence. The world was not entirely prepared for what he had to say. Not because it was sensational, it was not, but because it was real. Because it came from someone who was actually there. Because it filled in the human dimensions of a story that had, in its retelling and mythologizing, sometimes lost sight of the human beings at its center. Colin Tebbit's account will not resolve every question surrounding Diana's death. It will not silence every conspiracy theory or heal every grief. But it adds something irreplaceable to the record, the honest, dignified, heartbroken voice of a man who knew her, served her, cared for her, and has spent 30 years honoring her memory in the only way he knew how. By telling the truth. By finally, after all this time, telling the truth. Asterisk if this story moved you. Please consider sharing it with someone who remembers where they were when they heard the news. History is kept alive not just in official records, but in the quiet, personal accounts of the people who lived it. Thank you for reading. Asterisk.